Welcome back to Sleepy Crown, where history becomes your gentle companion into the peaceful world of dreams. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this quiet evening with us, settling into your favorite spot as we journey together through time. Tonight, we're traveling to the early 18th century to explore the remarkable yet heartbreaking life of Queen Anne, the last of the great Stuart monarchs. Hers is a story of quiet strength, masking profound loneliness, of constitutional triumph shadowed by personal tragedy. Anne united England and Scotland into Great Britain, oversaw military victories that established her nation as a European power, and navigated the treacherous waters of early party politics with surprising skill. Yet beneath the crown and ceremony lay a woman who endured 17 pregnancies, only to watch every child slip away, whose closest friendship became a public scandal, and who died isolated despite ruling over millions. If you're feeling a bit shy about leaving a comment tonight, that's perfectly all right. We understand. But know that you're part of our gentle Sleepy Crown family, and your presence here makes this community more wonderful. For those ready to share, we'd love to hear which aspect of Anne's bittersweet reign resonates most with you. If tonight's peaceful journey through royal history helps you find that perfect drowsy state, a gentle like would mean the world to us. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to Sleepy Crown. So let's dim the lights, settle deeper into comfort, and let the soft cadences of history carry us back to a time when a shy, stubborn princess would become the architect of modern Britain, even as her own heart slowly broke. Anne, later known as Queen Anne of Great Britain, and the last monarch of the House of Stuart, entered the world on a cold February morning in 1665. Born into a palace already thick with whispers of religious tension and political uncertainty, the second daughter of James, Duke of York, and his first wife Anne Hyde, the infant princess arrived at St. James's Palace during the reign of her uncle, the Merry Monarch Charles II, when Restoration England was still finding its footing after the turbulent years of civil war and Commonwealth. From her earliest days, young Anne lived in the shadow of her vivacious older sister Mary, who possessed the kind of effortless charm and quick wit that made courtiers gravitate toward her like moths to flame. Where Mary sparkled in conversation and moved through palace corridors with confident grace, Anne was quieter, more thoughtful, often content to observe rather than perform. Even as a small child, she displayed the stubborn streak that would characterize her entire life, a quiet determination that others sometimes mistook for simple-mindedness, but which would prove to be one of her greatest strengths. The princess grew up in apartments that overlooked the bustling streets of London, where she could hear the calls of vendors and the clip-clop of horses on cobblestones, sounds that connected her to the lives of subjects she would one day rule. Her mother, Anne Hyde, had been born a commoner, the daughter of Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, a fact that made the young princess more relatable to ordinary people, though it also made some courtiers question her royal breeding. The Duchess of York was a woman of sharp intelligence and strong opinions, qualities she would pass on to both her daughters, though in Anne these traits would manifest as a deep contemplative wisdom, rather than Mary's more obvious brilliance. Palace life during Anne's childhood was a curious mixture of luxury and uncertainty. The Restoration Court was known for its relaxed morality and love of pleasure, yet beneath the surface gaiety lay persistent anxieties about religion, succession, and the loyalty of the people. The young princess learned early that appearances mattered deeply at court, but she also absorbed a more profound lesson about the difference between public performance and private truth, a distinction that would shape her approach to queenship decades later. The religious education of the two princesses became a matter of intense political importance when their father's conversion to Catholicism became public knowledge in 1673. King Charles II, acutely aware of the Protestant sentiment among his subjects and Parliament, insisted that both Mary and Anne be raised in the Anglican faith, despite their father's new religious convictions. This decision created a strange dynamic in the family, the girls attending Protestant services while their father heard Catholic Mass in private, a division that taught Anne early lessons about the complex relationship between personal belief and political necessity. Anne's childhood was also marked by her introduction to Sarah Jennings, the girl who would become first her dearest friend and later her greatest source of heartache. Sarah, 5 years older than Anne, possessed everything the young princess lacked: dazzling beauty, quick wit, and an almost magnetic personality that drew people into her orbit. When Sarah arrived at court as a maid of honor to Anne's stepmother, Mary of Modena, she quickly caught the attention of the younger princess, who was hungry for friendship and perhaps a little starstruck by Sarah's confidence. Their early relationship had an almost fairy tale quality to it. Sarah would regale Anne with stories and gossip from the adult world of court politics, while Anne offered the older girl unwavering loyalty and genuine affection. They created secret codes and pet names for each other. Sarah became Mrs. Freeman and Anne Mrs. Morley, allowing them to correspond as equals despite the vast difference in their stations. These childish games would continue well into their adult years, becoming both a source of intimacy and, eventually, a symbol of the power imbalance that would destroy their friendship. The education Anne received was typical for a princess of her era. She learned French and Italian, studied music and dancing, and received instruction in the history and genealogies of European royal families. But she also absorbed more practical knowledge about statecraft simply by growing up in the midst of her uncle's court, observing how Charles II balanced the competing demands of Parliament, nobility, and foreign allies. The king himself was fond of his nieces, often including them in court ceremonies and teaching them by example how to project royal dignity while remaining approachable to subjects. Anne's physical development during these years would have lasting consequences for her adult life. She began showing signs of the corpulence that would characterize her later years, and also developed the eye problems and joint pain that would plague her throughout her reign. Some historians suggest these early health issues may have been connected to her eventual difficulty carrying children to term, though the medical knowledge of the era was insufficient to make such connections clear. The political atmosphere of Anne's youth was one of growing tension between Crown and Parliament, between Protestant and Catholic factions, and between those who supported strong royal prerogative and those who favoured parliamentary supremacy. The young princess absorbed these tensions without fully understanding them, but they shaped her intuitive grasp of the delicate balance required to maintain royal authority while working within England's evolving constitutional framework. As Anne grew into her teenage years, plans for her marriage became a frequent topic of court conversation. Unlike many royal marriages of the era, which were arranged purely for political advantage, Anne's eventual union with Prince George of Denmark would prove to be one of genuine affection and mutual devotion. But in her youth, she simply enjoyed the security of knowing she was valued and loved, both by her immediate family and by the broader court community that had watched her grow from a quiet, observant child into a young woman of surprising depth and gentle determination. The princess also developed during these years the deep attachment to the Church of England that would characterize her entire reign. While her religious devotion was sincere, it was also practical. She understood instinctively that Protestant faith was not merely a personal choice, but a political necessity for anyone who hoped to rule over England's predominantly Protestant population. This early understanding of the intersection between personal conviction and political reality would serve her well when she finally inherited the throne. The year 1683 brought profound change to Princess Anne's carefully ordered world when she wed Prince George of Denmark in a ceremony that would prove to be one of the few unalloyed sources of happiness in her life. Unlike so many royal marriages of the era, which were arranged purely for dynastic advantage and endured with resignation rather than embraced with joy, Anne's union with the handsome Danish prince blossomed into one of history's great royal love stories, a partnership of genuine affection that would sustain her through decades of political turmoil and personal tragedy. Prince George, brother to King Christian V of Denmark, arrived in England as part of a carefully orchestrated diplomatic alliance, but from their first meeting, it was clear that the match would be much more than a political convenience. The prince was described by contemporaries as tall and well-formed, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately appealed to Anne's somewhat shy nature. Where court life often demanded performance and calculation, George offered his bride something she had rarely experienced: unconditional acceptance and quiet devotion that asked nothing in return except her happiness. Their wedding, celebrated at St. James's Palace with appropriate royal splendour, marked the beginning of a domestic partnership that would endure every trial fate could devise. George possessed the rare quality of being content to live in his wife's shadow, never showing resentment at the constitutional reality that she, as an English princess, would always outrank him, regardless of his own royal blood. This gracious acceptance of a subordinate role was particularly remarkable in an age when male pride and prerogative were considered almost sacred, and it spoke to both his genuine love for Anne and his fundamental decency as a person. The early years of their marriage were marked by the kind of quiet contentment that rarely makes headlines, but forms the foundation of lasting happiness. Anne and George established their household in the cockpit at Whitehall, a residence that allowed them relative privacy while keeping them close to the centre of court life. The prince threw himself enthusiastically into English customs and politics, learning the language with endearing determination despite his persistent Danish accent, and showing genuine interest in his adopted country's naval traditions and military affairs. But it was in the private sphere that their union truly flourished. George proved to be exactly the kind of husband Anne needed, patient with her moods, understanding of her health problems, and willing to provide the emotional support she craved, without demanding that she reciprocate in ways that might drain her limited energy. He seemed to understand intuitively that his wife's somewhat melancholy temperament masked a deep well of feeling, and that her apparent laziness was actually a form of self-preservation in the face of chronic illness and the exhausting demands of royal life. The couple's happiness seemed complete when Anne became pregnant within months of their marriage. Both she and George approached the prospect of parenthood with joy and anticipation, imagining a nursery filled with healthy children who would carry on the Stuart line and provide England with a secure succession. The court shared their optimism, and preparations began for what everyone hoped would be the first of many royal births. But fate had cruel lessons in store for the young couple. Anne's first pregnancy ended in heartbreak when she gave birth to a stillborn daughter in the spring of 1684. The loss devastated both parents, but particularly Anne, who began to develop the anxious, protective attitude toward pregnancy that would characterize all her subsequent experiences with childbearing. The court physicians offered various explanations and treatments, but the medical knowledge of the era was woefully inadequate to address the underlying causes of Anne's reproductive difficulties. Undaunted by their first tragedy, Anne and George tried again, and their persistence seemed rewarded when Anne gave birth to a living daughter, Mary, in June 1685. The little princess appeared healthy at birth, and for a few precious months, Anne experienced the joy of motherhood that had been denied her the previous year. But baby Mary lived only until February 1687, succumbing to one of the many childhood diseases that claimed so many young lives in that era. Her death plunged Anne into a grief so profound that courtiers worried for her sanity, while George struggled to provide comfort while dealing with his own heartbreak. The pattern was now established: conception followed by hope, birth followed by loss, joy inevitably shadowed by sorrow. Anne's next pregnancy resulted in another miscarriage. Then came the birth of George in 1688, who survived only minutes after his arrival. Each loss carved deeper wounds in Anne's heart, while also creating physical damage that made subsequent pregnancies even more difficult and dangerous. The court physicians prescribed various treatments: bloodletting, purges, mineral waters, but nothing seemed to address the fundamental problem. Through all these trials, Prince George remained a pillar of strength and comfort for his wife. While other husbands of the era might have blamed their wives for failing to produce healthy heirs or sought consolation elsewhere, George never wavered in his devotion to Anne. He held her through nights of weeping, celebrated each new pregnancy as enthusiastically as the first, and grieved each loss as deeply as she did. His steadfast love provided the emotional foundation that allowed Anne to continue trying, despite the mounting evidence that carrying children to term would remain an almost insurmountable challenge. The couple's reproductive struggles took place against the backdrop of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when Anne's father, James II, was deposed in favour of her sister Mary and brother-in-law, William of Orange. This political upheaval added another layer of stress to an already difficult period, as Anne was forced to choose between loyalty to her father and support for the Protestant succession. Her decision to support William and Mary, while politically necessary, created lasting tensions within the family and added guilt to the many burdens she was already carrying. Yet even amid these national and personal crises, Anne's marriage remained a source of strength and stability. George supported her political choices without question, understanding that his wife's primary obligation was to England and its people, rather than to family ties that conflicted with the nation's best interests. His loyalty during this difficult period deepened Anne's appreciation for his character and strengthened their bond even further. The birth of Sophia in 1689 brought renewed hope, as the little girl seemed stronger and healthier than her siblings. For almost a year, Anne dared to believe that her luck had finally turned, that she had at last produced the healthy daughter who would secure the Stuart succession. But Sophia too died in January 1690, leaving her parents once again devastated by loss and increasingly desperate for a living child. As the 1690s progressed, Anne's reproductive history became a source of international concern, as European courts watched anxiously to see whether she would be able to provide an heir to the English throne. Each pregnancy was noted by foreign ambassadors, each loss reported back to their home governments as intelligence relevant to the balance of power in Europe. This public scrutiny added yet another burden to an already difficult situation, making Anne's personal tragedies into matters of state importance. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this period was how it strengthened rather than weakened Anne's marriage to George. Where such sustained tragedy might have driven other couples apart, it seemed to bind Anne and George more closely together, creating a partnership of shared sorrow that deepened their understanding and appreciation of each other. Their love story was not one of passionate romance, but of steady devotion, not marked by grand gestures, but by the daily choice to support and cherish each other through unimaginable heartbreak. In the spring of 1700, after more than a decade of heartbreak and dashed hopes, Anne's prayers seemed finally to have been answered with the birth of a son who would not only survive his first dangerous weeks, but would grow into a bright, engaging child who captured the hearts of everyone around him. Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, arrived in the world on July 24, 1689, and for the first time in her reproductive history, Anne dared to believe that her trials as a mother might finally be ending, that she had at last produced the heir who would secure both her personal happiness and England's constitutional stability. Little William was everything his parents had dreamed of in a child, alert from his earliest days, quick to smile, and possessed of the kind of sunny temperament that seemed to promise good health and a long life. Where Anne's previous children had been fragile creatures who struggled from birth, William displayed a robust constitution that allowed him to pass each developmental milestone with encouraging success. He learned to walk and talk at appropriate times, showed signs of intelligence that delighted his tutors, and demonstrated the kind of physical activity that suggested he would grow into a strong, capable adult. The court celebrated William's survival of his first birthday as a national triumph, and his second birthday was marked with even greater festivities, as it became clear that this Stuart prince might actually live to inherit his mother's throne. Foreign ambassadors sent detailed reports about the young prince's health and development to their home governments, recognizing that the survival of Anne's son would have profound implications for the European balance of power. The succession question that had haunted English politics for decades seemed finally to be resolved. For Anne herself, William's presence transformed her daily existence in ways both profound and subtle. The constant anxiety that had characterized her previous pregnancies was replaced by the ordinary pleasures and concerns of motherhood, watching him take his first steps, delighting in his attempts at conversation, worrying about the usual childhood ailments that seemed minor compared to the catastrophic losses she had previously endured. She threw herself into the role of mother with an intensity that sometimes concerned her household, but which reflected the deep well of maternal love that had been denied expression for so many years. Prince George, too, found in his son a source of joy that seemed to compensate for all their previous sorrows. The Danish prince, who had shown such patience and understanding through Anne's darkest periods, now revealed a playful side of his personality that had been suppressed by years of grief. He could often be found on hands and knees in the nursery, playing with William and his toy soldiers, or carrying the boy on his shoulders through the palace gardens, while explaining the names and habits of various flowers and birds. William's childhood was marked by all the advantages that royal birth could provide, but also by the particular attention that comes with being an only child, whose survival represents so much hope. He had the finest tutors available, learned languages and mathematics, studied history and geography, and received instruction in dancing, music, and the other accomplishments expected of a future king. But he also enjoyed the kind of focused parental attention that was rare in royal families, where children were typically raised primarily by servants and saw their parents only for formal occasions. The young prince showed early signs of the military interest that would become his passion. He was fascinated by soldiers and battles, collected toy regiments with obsessive enthusiasm, and could spend hours arranging miniature armies in complex formations that demonstrated both strategic thinking and remarkable attention to detail. His parents indulged this interest, recognizing that military knowledge would be essential for any future king. But they also worried about his tendency to become so absorbed in his games that he forgot to eat or rest properly. As William approached his 10th birthday, plans began for his more formal education and eventual introduction to the business of government. Parliament took increasing interest in the prince's development, and constitutional scholars debated questions about his future role and the powers he would exercise when he came of age. The succession that had seemed so uncertain during Anne's years of reproductive failure now appeared secure, and the political establishment began making long-term plans based on the assumption that William would one day rule as William IV. But even as the court celebrated the prince's survival and development, careful observers noted certain troubling signs that his parents preferred to ignore or dismiss. William was smaller than other boys his age, and though his intelligence was obvious, there were subtle indications that all was not entirely well. He sometimes complained of headaches, showed unusual sensitivity to bright light, and occasionally displayed balance problems that his tutors attributed to simple clumsiness, but which may have been early symptoms of the condition that would ultimately claim his life. The medical knowledge of the era was insufficient to recognize the signs of hydrocephalus, the accumulation of fluid in the brain that was slowly increasing pressure on William's developing nervous system. The condition progressed so gradually that those around him adapted to his limitations without recognizing them as symptoms of serious illness. His frequent headaches were attributed to studying too hard, his occasional dizziness blamed on growing too quickly, his sensitivity to light dismissed as a minor peculiarity that he would outgrow. Anne herself may have noticed some of these warning signs, but her desperate desire to believe in her son's health caused her to rationalize away anything that might suggest problems. After so many losses, she had invested all her emotional resources in William's survival, and the possibility that he too might be vulnerable was simply too terrible to contemplate seriously. She focused instead on his obvious intelligence, his engaging personality, and his apparent physical activity, using these positive signs to reassure herself that her miracle child would indeed live to fulfill all their hopes. The prince's 11th birthday in July 1700 was celebrated with particular enthusiasm, as it marked his successful passage through the most dangerous period of childhood mortality. Court physicians proclaimed him healthy and robust. Foreign ambassadors reported to their governments that the English succession appeared secure, and Parliament began making more definitive plans for his eventual reign. The future seemed brighter than it had in decades, and Anne allowed herself to imagine the day when she would pass the crown to a son who had inherited both her devotion to duty and his father's strength of character. But fate was preparing one final devastating blow for the parents who had endured so much heartbreak and had finally dared to hope. The same condition that had been slowly developing throughout William's childhood was approaching a crisis that would transform the royal family's joy into their deepest sorrow and would ultimately change the course of English history. The miracle child who had seemed to promise so much was about to become another name on the long list of Anne's lost children, the most heartbreaking loss of all, because he had lived long enough to become a real person with hopes and dreams and the promise of a full life ahead of him. The summer of 1700 began with such promise for the royal family, as Prince William celebrated his 11th birthday with the kind of elaborate festivities that befitted the heir to the throne. The young Duke appeared to be thriving, had recently begun more advanced studies in preparation for his eventual role as king, and seemed to embody all the hopes that his parents had invested in him over the long years of waiting and loss. But within weeks of those joyful celebrations, a series of events would unfold that would shatter Anne's world more completely than any of her previous tragedies, because this time she would lose not just an infant who had barely begun to live, but a beloved child who had become the center of her emotional universe. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came in late July, when William began complaining of severe headaches that were unlike anything he had experienced before. These were not the mild discomfort that had occasionally bothered him in the past, but intense, throbbing pain that left him pale and nauseated, unable to concentrate on his lessons or enjoy his usual games with toy soldiers. Anne initially attributed these symptoms to the summer heat, or perhaps overexertion, but as the headaches became more frequent and severe, she began to feel the familiar clutch of maternal anxiety that she had hoped never to experience again. The court physicians were summoned to examine the prince, but their understanding of neurological conditions was so limited that they could offer little beyond the standard treatments of the era: bloodletting, purges, and various herbal remedies that were more likely to weaken than heal. They spoke confidently about an imbalance of humours and prescribed treatments that had been used for centuries, but their primitive knowledge was utterly inadequate to address the hydrocephalus that was now reaching a critical stage in William's young brain. As the days passed, William's condition deteriorated rapidly. The headaches were joined by episodes of dizziness and confusion that frightened everyone who witnessed them. The bright, engaging boy who had charmed the court with his intelligence and enthusiasm began having difficulty focusing his thoughts or maintaining his balance. His appetite disappeared, and he grew increasingly listless, spending long hours lying in darkened rooms because bright light had become unbearable to his overpressured optic nerves. Anne threw herself into nursing her son with the desperate intensity of a mother who had already lost too many children and could not bear the thought of another tragedy. She barely left his bedside, monitoring every change in his condition, trying every remedy suggested by the parade of physicians and quacks who offered their services to the desperate royal family. Prince George, equally devoted but perhaps more realistic about the likely outcome, struggled to support his wife while dealing with his own growing grief and fear. The political implications of William's illness added another layer of anxiety to an already unbearable situation. Parliament had been making plans based on the assumption that the prince would survive to inherit the throne, and his sudden illness raised uncomfortable questions about the succession that no one wanted to address directly while the child still lived. Foreign ambassadors sent urgent dispatches to their home governments, reporting on the prince's condition and speculating about what his death might mean for European politics and the balance of power. By the end of July, it was clear that William was dying, though no one could bring themselves to speak this truth aloud. The brave little boy who had survived infancy against such long odds was losing his battle with the condition that had been silently growing in his brain since birth. His periods of lucidity became briefer and more infrequent, punctuated by episodes of delirium during which he didn't recognize even his devoted parents. The palace took on the hushed, anxious atmosphere that precedes royal death, with servants moving quietly through corridors and courtiers speaking in hushed tones, whispers about the tragedy that was unfolding behind closed doors. Anne's vigil at her son's bedside during these final days was heartbreaking to witness. The Queen, who would later rule with dignity and determination, was reduced to the most primal role of motherhood, holding her dying child, trying to comfort him during his moments of consciousness, and praying desperately for a miracle that would never come. She sang him the lullaby she had sung throughout his childhood, read from his favourite books about soldiers and battles, and whispered promises about all the wonderful things they would do together when he recovered, even though she knew in her heart that recovery was impossible. Prince George, watching his wife's anguish while dealing with his own grief, understood that William's death would devastate Anne in ways that their previous losses had not. Those earlier children had been infants who had barely begun to exist as individuals, but William had been a real person with a distinct personality, hopes for the future, and 11 years of shared memories that would make his absence a permanent wound in his parents' hearts. the Danish prince prepared himself not only to mourn his son, but to support a wife who might never fully recover from this final overwhelming blow. On July 30th, 1700, exactly 5 days after his 11th birthday, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, died in his parents' arms, his brief life ending just as it had begun, surrounded by love but ultimately defeated by the medical limitations of his era. His death was officially attributed to fever, as the real cause of his illness was beyond the understanding of contemporary physicians, but the true culprit was the hydrocephalus that had been slowly killing him throughout the childhood that everyone had celebrated as a triumph over fate. The immediate aftermath of William's death was a study in royal grief, barely contained by the demands of protocol. Anne collapsed completely, her composure finally shattered by this loss that seemed to mock all her years of hope and patience. Prince George, himself devastated, had to manage both his own sorrow and his wife's breakdown while dealing with the immediate practical consequences of the succession crisis that William's death had created. The miracle child, who was supposed to solve England's dynastic problems, had instead returned them to the uncertain state that had existed before his birth. The funeral arrangements reflected both the genuine sorrow of the court and the political necessity of maintaining royal dignity, even in the face of personal catastrophe. William was buried with the honours due to a prince, but the ceremony was marked by an unusual intimacy that reflected how beloved he had been by everyone who knew him. Anne and George, barely able to function through their grief, followed their son's small coffin to Westminster Abbey, where he would rest among his royal ancestors despite having lived such a brief life. The death of Prince William marked the end of Anne's hopes for biological motherhood and the beginning of a period of profound depression that would affect her for the rest of her life. She had invested so much emotional energy in this one surviving child that his loss left her feeling empty and purposeless, unable to find meaning in the royal duties that had previously seemed important. The woman, who would later prove to be a capable and effective queen, spent months after William's death barely able to leave her chambers, overwhelmed by grief and convinced that she was cursed to lose everything she held dear. On the cold morning of March 8th, 1702, a riding accident at Hampton Court would change the course of history and place upon Anne's reluctant shoulders the weight of a crown she had never expected to wear. King William III, thrown from his horse when the animal stumbled over a molehill, died from complications related to his injuries, leaving the throne to his sister-in-law at one of the most challenging moments in England's history. At 37 years old, still mourning the loss of her beloved son William just 2 years earlier, and struggling with the chronic health problems that would plague her entire reign, Anne found herself thrust into the role of Queen Regnant at a time when her nation was embroiled in continental warfare and facing unprecedented domestic political tensions. The immediate circumstances of her accession could hardly have been more daunting. The War of the Spanish Succession was raging across Europe, with England committed to preventing French domination of the continent through military action that was both expensive and unpopular with many of her subjects. Parliament was increasingly divided between Whigs and Tories, whose philosophical differences about the role of government, religious policy, and foreign affairs would define much of Anne's reign. The question of succession remained unresolved, as Anne's failure to produce a living heir meant that the throne would eventually pass to the German House of Hanover, rather than remaining with the Stuart dynasty that had ruled Scotland since 1371 and England since 1603. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, Anne approached her new role with a quiet determination that surprised those who had known her primarily as a grieving mother and the rather passive younger sister of the more charismatic Mary II. Her first speech to Parliament, delivered with a clear, strong voice that belied her physical frailties, established the tone that would characterize her entire reign. She emphasized her essential Englishness, a pointed contrast to the Dutch William III, and declared her absolute commitment to the Protestant faith and the constitutional settlement that limited royal power while preserving monarchical dignity. The early months of Anne's reign were marked by the careful navigation of political waters that had claimed many of her predecessors. Unlike her father James II, who had tried to rule through royal prerogative and had been deposed for his efforts, or William III, who had often seemed more interested in European affairs than English domestic politics, Anne understood instinctively that successful monarchy in the early 18th century required cooperation with Parliament and sensitivity to public opinion. She possessed what many considered an essentially English temperament, practical, steady, and deeply conservative, qualities that served her well in managing the competing demands of different political factions. Her coronation on April 23, 1702, was both a celebration of continuity and an acknowledgement of change. The ancient ceremonies were performed with all traditional dignity, but Anne's physical condition required certain accommodations that reflected both her personal struggles and the evolving nature of monarchy. Suffering from gout and already showing signs of the obesity that would characterize her later years, she had to be carried to Westminster Abbey in a specially designed chair that allowed her to participate in the sacred rituals despite her physical limitations. The image of the Queen being carried to her crowning became a potent symbol of the gap between royal dignity and human frailty that would define her reign. From the beginning, Anne made it clear that she intended to rule as well as reign, actively participating in government decisions rather than serving as a mere figurehead for her ministers. This approach required her to master complex issues of foreign policy, military strategy, religious affairs, and economic policy despite having received little formal preparation for such responsibilities. Her childhood observations of court life and her natural intelligence served her well, but she also had to rely heavily on advisors whose loyalty and competence would prove crucial to her success. The most important of these early relationships was with John Churchill, whom she elevated to Duke of Marlborough and appointed as Captain General of her forces. Churchill's military genius would prove instrumental in England's success in the War of the Spanish Succession, but his appointment was also deeply personal. He was married to Sarah Churchill, Anne's closest friend, and his elevation reflected Anne's desire to surround herself with people she trusted completely. This decision would have profound consequences for both her reign and her personal happiness, as the Marlborough connection would ultimately become a source of great political strength and devastating personal pain. Anne's approach to religious policy reflected both her genuine piety and her political astuteness. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she was committed to maintaining the Protestant settlement while avoiding the kind of religious persecution that had characterized previous reigns. She supported the High Church party within Anglicanism, which emphasized traditional liturgy and episcopal authority, but she also showed tolerance for Protestant dissenters when political circumstances required it. This balanced approach helped maintain domestic peace while reinforcing her credentials as a defender of the Protestant faith against Catholic threats from France and the Jacobite movement. The Queen's daily routine during these early years established patterns that would continue throughout her reign. She rose early and spent considerable time in private prayer and religious devotion, activities that provided both spiritual comfort and practical preparation for the moral complexities of ruling. Her mornings were typically devoted to meetings with ministers and the review of state papers, work that she approached with meticulous attention to detail, despite the physical discomfort caused by her various ailments. Afternoons often included more formal, court ceremonies or meetings with foreign ambassadors, while evenings were reserved for correspondence and time with her husband, Prince George, whose steady support remained crucial to her emotional well-being. The transformation from grieving mother to effective queen was not immediate or easy. Anne continued to struggle with periods of depression and anxiety, particularly during the anniversary dates of her children's deaths, or when faced with political crises that seemed to threaten everything she held dear. But she gradually developed the kind of quiet confidence that comes from successfully managing difficult situations, and her early decisions established her reputation as a monarch who could be trusted to put England's interest above personal considerations or factional politics. By the end of her first year as queen, Anne had successfully navigated the immediate challenges of her accession and had begun to establish her own distinctive style of monarchy. She had avoided the political mistakes that had destroyed her father's reign, had begun to build effective working relationships with parliamentary leaders from both parties, and had provided the steady leadership that England needed during a time of international uncertainty. The shy, stubborn princess, who had suffered so many personal tragedies, was proving herself capable of rising above private grief to serve the public good, though the full cost of this transformation would not become apparent until much later in her reign. The drums of war that had echoed across Europe since 1701 found their most eloquent expression in the military genius of John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, whose campaigns during Anne's reign would establish England as the dominant power in European affairs and create a military reputation that would endure for generations. The War of the Spanish Succession, known in some quarters as Queen Anne's War, represented far more than a dynastic dispute over the throne of Spain. It was a fundamental struggle for the balance of power in Europe, pitting the ambitions of Louis XIV's France against a grand alliance determined to prevent French hegemony over the continent. Queen Anne's decision to appoint Marlborough as Captain General of her forces proved to be one of the most consequential choices of her reign, though it was motivated as much by personal loyalty as by strategic calculation. Marlborough's wife Sarah remained Anne's dearest friend and most trusted confidant, and the Queen's elevation of John Churchill reflected her desire to reward those who had stood by her through the difficult years before her accession. Yet this personal decision would prove strategically brilliant, as Marlborough possessed the rare combination of tactical genius, strategic vision, and diplomatic skill that the complex European conflict demanded. The Duke understood from the outset that success against Louis XIV's formidable military machine would require more than conventional siege warfare or defensive strategies. French armies had dominated European battlefields for decades, their apparent invincibility serving both military and psychological purposes in Louis's grand design for continental supremacy. To defeat such a power would require innovative tactics, careful coalition management, and the kind of audacious operational planning that could strike at the heart of French strategic objectives while maintaining the fragile unity of the Grand Alliance. Marlborough's first great opportunity to demonstrate his military genius came in 1704, when French and Bavarian forces threatened to capture Vienna and potentially knock the Austrian Habsburgs out of the war entirely. Rather than pursue the conventional strategy of defending the Low Countries, where English and Dutch forces had traditionally operated, Marlborough conceived a daring plan to march his army across Germany and strike directly at the Franco-Bavarian forces threatening the Austrian capital. This 250-mile march through hostile territory represented one of the most audacious strategic movements in military history, requiring perfect coordination of logistics, diplomacy, and deception. The logistical challenges of moving an army of 40,000 men across the breadth of Germany were staggering, particularly given the need to maintain secrecy about the ultimate destination. Marlborough worked carefully with Dutch field deputies and German princes to ensure adequate supplies and safe passage, while simultaneously conducting a masterful deception campaign that convinced French commanders he was planning conventional operations in the Netherlands. The march itself became a model of military organization, with pre-positioned supplies, carefully planned rest stops, and medical support that allowed the army to arrive at its destination in excellent fighting condition. The culmination of this strategic masterpiece came on August 13th, 1704, at the village of Blenheim on the banks of the Danube, where Marlborough and his Austrian ally Prince Eugene of Savoy confronted a combined Franco-Bavarian army under Marshal Tallard. The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most decisive encounters in European military history, a complete victory that shattered the myth of French invincibility and fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the war. The Battle of Blenheim was notable not only for its strategic consequences, but for the tactical innovation that Marlborough displayed in achieving victory. Rather than pursuing the linear tactics that dominated 18th century warfare, he coordinated a complex series of attacks that confused and ultimately overwhelmed his opponents. The Duke personally led cavalry charges at crucial moments, demonstrating the kind of physical courage that inspired absolute devotion from his troops, while simultaneously managing the broader tactical situation with the detached calculation of a chess master. The victory was complete and devastating. French casualties exceeded 27,000 killed, wounded, and captured, including Marshal Tallard himself, who was taken prisoner along with numerous other senior officers. More importantly, the Franco-Bavarian threat to Vienna was eliminated entirely. Bavaria was knocked out of the war, and Louis XIV's hopes for a quick victory were definitively shattered. The psychological impact was even greater than the military consequences, as European courts recognized that French dominance was no longer inevitable, and that the Grand Alliance possessed a military leader capable of matching anything the enemy could produce. News of Blenheim's triumph reached London on August 21st, carried by Marlborough's aide-de-camp, Captain Park, who rode directly to Windsor Castle to present Queen Anne with the Duke's hastily scribbled dispatch, written on the back of a tavern bill. The Queen's joy at this vindication of her military appointments was matched by the euphoria of her subjects, who celebrated England's first major continental victory in generations with bonfires, church services, and patriotic demonstrations that continued for days. Parliament voted Marlborough the Royal Manor of Woodstock and funds to build a magnificent palace as a permanent monument to his victory, while Anne personally awarded him the Order of the Garter and elevated his dukedom to ensure it would pass to his heirs in perpetuity. But Blenheim was only the beginning of Marlborough's remarkable series of victories. In 1706, his triumph at Ramillies drove French forces from most of the Spanish Netherlands, while 1708 brought another crushing defeat for Louis XIV's armies at Oudenarde. Each victory demonstrated different aspects of Marlborough's military genius: his ability to coordinate with allied commanders, his skill at exploiting enemy weaknesses, and his talent for turning tactical advantages into strategic gains that advanced the overall war effort. The human cost of these triumphs was enormous, both for the armies involved and for the civilian populations caught in the path of military operations. Marlborough was acutely conscious of this burden and worked consistently to minimize unnecessary suffering while pursuing military objectives. His treatment of prisoners and civilian populations won respect even from his enemies, while his care for his own troops' welfare earned him a devotion that proved crucial in sustaining morale during the war's most difficult periods. The political implications of Marlborough's victories extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Each triumph strengthened England's position in European diplomacy, allowing Queen Anne's government to negotiate from a position of strength rather than merely reacting to French initiatives. The war gradually evolved from a defensive struggle to preserve the balance of power into an offensive campaign aimed at reducing French hegemony and establishing a new European order more favourable to English interests, yet success in war brought its own political complications, as the enormous costs of maintaining armies in the field strained England's financial resources and created domestic tensions that would ultimately threaten both Marlborough's position and Queen Anne's political stability. The Whig Party, which strongly supported continental warfare, used military success to increase their influence in government, while Tory opponents argued that England was bearing a disproportionate share of the alliance's burdens for gains that primarily benefited other powers. The Duke himself remained focused on military rather than political objectives, but his very success made him a target for those who resented the influence that victory had brought to his family. Sarah Churchill's dominant position as Queen Anne's favourite was increasingly attributed to her husband's military achievements rather than her personal relationship with the Queen, a perception that would eventually contribute to the breakdown of one of the most important friendships in English royal history. As the war dragged on through the middle years of Anne's reign, Marlborough's continued success became both a source of national pride and a political liability. The victories that had once united the country in celebration began to divide it along party lines, with Whigs demanding continued commitment to continental warfare, while Tories increasingly questioned whether English blood and treasure should be spent for objectives that seemed to benefit foreigners more than Englishmen. In the quiet chambers of Kensington Palace, beneath the formal protocols and ceremonial splendour that defined royal life, one of history's most complex and ultimately tragic friendships was slowly transforming from a source of mutual strength into an instrument of political manipulation and personal destruction. The relationship between Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, had begun in childhood innocence, flourished during Anne's years as a princess, and reached its zenith in the early period of her reign, when Sarah's husband's military victories made the Marlborough family the most powerful force in English politics. But power, as both women would learn to their lasting sorrow, has a way of corrupting even the most genuine affections, and by the middle years of Anne's reign, their friendship had become a battleground where personal loyalty warred with political ambition, where private grievances became public scandals, and where two strong-willed women discovered that love and power make for a volatile and ultimately destructive combination. The seeds of their eventual estrangement lay paradoxically in the very success that had initially strengthened their bond. Sarah's elevation to the positions of groom of the stole, mistress of the robes, and keeper of the privy purse gave her unprecedented access to the Queen and enormous influence over court appointments, government patronage, and even policy decisions. This concentration of power in the hands of someone who was technically a mere courtier, albeit a duchess, created resentment among other nobles and ministers who found themselves required to curry favour with Sarah in order to gain access to their sovereign. More troubling still was the gradual shift in the dynamic between the two women, where their childhood and young adult relationship had been based on genuine affection and mutual need. Anne craving friendship and Sarah offering protection and worldly sophistication. Their mature relationship became increasingly characterized by Sarah's domination and Anne's growing resentment of that domination. The pet names Mrs. Freeman and Mrs. Morley, that had once symbolized equality and intimacy, began to take on darker connotations as Sarah used her position as Freeman to lecture and berate the Queen, with an informality that would have been impossible in any other relationship. Sarah's political convictions added another layer of tension to their interactions. As a committed Whig, she believed passionately in parliamentary supremacy, religious tolerance for Protestant dissenters, and aggressive prosecution of the war against France. Anne, by temperament and conviction more sympathetic to Tory positions, favoured a stronger role for royal prerogative, supported the High Church party within Anglicanism, and was increasingly concerned about the financial and human costs of continental warfare. These philosophical differences might have remained manageable between ordinary friends, but when one of those friends was the Queen, and the other was determined to use their relationship to advance specific political objectives, conflict became inevitable. The Duchess's methods of political persuasion proved particularly corrosive to their personal relationship. Rather than presenting her views respectfully and accepting the Queen's right to disagree, Sarah adopted an increasingly hectoring tone that treated Anne's political opinions as evidence of stupidity or moral failing. She would lecture the Queen for hours about the necessity of supporting Whig policies, dismiss Tory ministers as secret Jacobites or French sympathisers, and use her intimate knowledge of Anne's character weaknesses to apply emotional pressure in support of her political objectives. Anne, for her part, began to develop the kind of passive resistance that was her characteristic response to unwelcome pressure. Rather than confronting Sarah directly about her behaviour, the Queen simply became less available for private conversations, more formal in their official interactions, and increasingly reliant on other advisers who offered counsel without accompanying lectures about her moral and intellectual deficiencies. This withdrawal only intensified Sarah's frustration and led to even more aggressive attempts to regain her former influence. The introduction of Abigail Hill into this volatile situation provided the catalyst that would ultimately destroy the friendship entirely. Abigail, who was actually Sarah's own cousin and had been placed in royal service through Sarah's influence, possessed exactly the qualities that the Duchess lacked: a quiet, unassuming manner, genuine sympathy for Anne's physical and emotional needs, and the wisdom to offer comfort without attempting to control or dominate. Where Sarah brought political agendas and personal drama into every interaction, Abigail provided the kind of peaceful companionship that Anne desperately craved. The Queen's growing attachment to her new chambermaid represented more than simple preference for one personality over another. It reflected her deep hunger for a relationship that was not constantly complicated by political calculations and emotional manipulation. With Abigail, Anne could simply be herself, without worrying about hidden agendas or unwelcome lectures. The younger woman's presence in the royal apartments provided a refuge from the pressures that Sarah had come to represent, and Anne began to treasure these moments of genuine tranquility. Sarah's reaction to this new friendship revealed the extent to which her relationship with Anne had become possessive rather than genuinely caring. Rather than recognizing that her own behavior had driven the Queen to seek companionship elsewhere, she interpreted Abigail's influence as evidence of betrayal and conspiracy. The Duchess began spreading rumors that the Queen's attachment to Abigail was sexual in nature, accusations that reflected both her own desperation to discredit her rival and her willingness to damage Anne's reputation in pursuit of her political objectives. The public nature of these accusations marked the point of no return in the breakdown of the friendship. Anne, whose sense of personal dignity was one of her strongest characteristics, could not forgive Sarah for subjecting her to this kind of public humiliation. The woman who had once been her dearest friend had become a source of scandal and embarrassment, using their shared intimacies as weapons in a political battle that Anne had never wanted to fight. The final confrontation between the two women took place at Kensington Palace on April 6, 1710, in a scene that captured all the bitterness and mutual recrimination that their friendship had become. Sarah, desperate to salvage her position, demanded an explanation for Anne's coldness and accused her of ingratitude for all the years of loyal service. Anne, finally pushed beyond the limits of her patience, responded with the kind of icy formality that marked the end of any possibility of reconciliation. "Whatever you have to say, you may put it in writing," the Queen repeated over and over, refusing to engage with Sarah's emotional appeals or political arguments. "You said you desired no answer, and I shall give you none." The repetition of these phrases, recorded by Sarah herself in her later memoirs, captured the complete breakdown of communication between two women who had once shared their deepest secrets and most intimate thoughts. Sarah's final attempt to maintain her position involved a threat that revealed how completely their relationship had been corrupted by political considerations. She implied that she possessed letters from Anne that could be interpreted as evidence of improper attachment, and suggested that she might be forced to publish these private communications if she were not treated with appropriate respect. This blackmail attempt, for that is what it was, despite Sarah's attempts to disguise it as concern for Anne's reputation, represented the ultimate betrayal of the trust that had once bound them together. The Queen's response was swift and decisive. Sarah was stripped of all her court positions, banished from royal presence, and effectively exiled from the centre of power she had inhabited for so many years. The woman who had once been Anne's most trusted advisor and intimate friend became persona non grata, her name mentioned at court only in whispers, and her influence reduced to the bitter memoir she would write years later to justify her behaviour and settle old scores. The end of their friendship marked not just a personal tragedy for both women, but a significant shift in the political dynamics of Anne's reign. Without Sarah's aggressive advocacy for Whig policies, the Queen began to rely more heavily on Tory advisers who shared her preference for a negotiated end to the Continental War and a return to more traditional English domestic policies. This political realignment would have profound consequences for the final years of Anne's reign and for the long-term direction of English government. For Anne personally, the loss of Sarah's friendship represented another in a long series of personal tragedies that had marked her adult life. The woman who had helped her through the deaths of her children, supported her during the difficult years before her accession, and shared her triumphs during the early years of her reign was now gone, leaving behind only bitter memories and a sense of profound betrayal that would shadow Anne's remaining years on the throne. Among the great constitutional achievements of Queen Anne's reign, none would prove more lasting or significant than the Act of Union of 1707, which formally united the kingdoms of England and Scotland into a single political entity known as Great Britain. This momentous legislation represented the culmination of more than a century of tentative steps toward closer integration between two nations that had shared monarchs since 1603, but had maintained separate parliaments, separate currencies, and often conflicting foreign policies that made effective governance increasingly difficult. The Union did not emerge from any sudden burst of national brotherhood or shared affection between English and Scottish peoples, but rather from the hard-headed recognition by political leaders on both sides of the border that their existing arrangements were becoming dangerously unstable. The succession crisis, created by Anne's failure to produce living heirs, had exposed fundamental weaknesses in the personal union that had existed since James VI of Scotland became James I of England, weaknesses that threatened to tear apart the British Isles and potentially drag both nations into devastating civil conflict. The immediate catalyst for serious union negotiations came from the Scottish Parliament's passage of the Act of Security in 1704, which explicitly reserved Scotland's right to choose its own successor to Queen Anne, rather than automatically accepting the Hanoverian settlement that the English Parliament had imposed through the Act of Settlement of 1701. This legislative assertion of Scottish independence in matters of succession created the very real possibility that Anne's death would result in different monarchs ruling north and south of the border, a scenario that could easily have led to renewed warfare between the two kingdoms. English reaction to Scottish assertions of independence was swift and characteristically pragmatic. The Alien Act of 1705, passed by the English Parliament, threatened to treat all Scots as foreigners unless union negotiations began by Christmas of that year, a designation that would have excluded Scottish merchants from English markets and effectively devastated Scotland's already fragile economy. This legislative blackmail represented the kind of economic coercion that England could apply because of its vastly superior wealth and population, but it also reflected genuine English concern about having a potentially hostile power on their northern border. Queen Anne herself played a crucial role in bringing the union negotiations to fruition, though her motivations were more personal than economic or strategic. The childless queen understood better than anyone the dangers that succession uncertainty posed to the stability of her realms, and she was determined to prevent the kind of religious and dynastic conflicts that had plagued the British Isles throughout the 17th century. Her commitment to the Protestant settlement made Scottish acceptance of the Hanoverian succession a matter of fundamental importance, while her genuine care for the welfare of all her subjects made her receptive to arguments that union would benefit both nations. The actual negotiations, conducted by teams of commissioners appointed by both parliaments, revealed the complex web of economic, religious, and political considerations that made union both necessary and difficult. Scottish representatives, led by figures like the Duke of Queensberry, faced the challenge of securing the best possible terms for a nation that was negotiating from a position of obvious weakness. The failure of the Darien scheme had left Scotland virtually bankrupt, while English control over colonial trade meant that Scottish merchants were effectively excluded from the most profitable areas of international commerce. English negotiators, while holding most of the economic and military advantages, recognized that a successful union required Scottish consent rather than mere submission. Heavy-handed attempts to force unwelcome terms on Scotland could easily backfire by strengthening Jacobite sentiment and creating lasting resentment that would undermine the very stability that union was meant to provide. The English strategy therefore combined economic incentives with political concessions designed to preserve Scottish dignity while securing English strategic objectives. The final terms of union, agreed to in July 1706 and embodied in 25 articles, represented a careful balance between integration and autonomy that would prove remarkably durable despite initial controversies. Scotland accepted the Hanoverian succession and agreed to dissolve its separate parliament, while England provided substantial financial compensation, the famous equivalent of nearly £400,000, to help Scotland pay off its national debt and compensate for its assumption of a share in England's much larger financial obligations. Perhaps more importantly for long-term stability, the Union preserved those aspects of Scottish life that were most important to Scottish identity. The Presbyterian Church of Scotland was guaranteed continued independence from the Anglican establishment, while Scottish law and the Scottish court system were maintained as separate institutions under the new British framework. These religious and legal protections ensured that union would not mean the complete Anglicisation of Scotland, a crucial consideration for Scottish commissioners who were already facing accusations that they were betraying their country's independence. The parliamentary debates over ratification revealed the depth of popular opposition to union on both sides of the border, though for very different reasons. In Scotland, opponents like Andrew Fletcher of Saltoun argued passionately that union would reduce their ancient kingdom to the status of an English province, destroying Scottish independence for the sake of temporary economic advantages. The streets of Edinburgh filled with protesters during the parliamentary sessions, and several commissioners required military protection from crowds that viewed them as traitors to the Scottish nation. English opposition was less dramatic, but reflected genuine concerns about the wisdom of closer integration with a poorer and potentially unreliable northern neighbour. Some English members of Parliament worried that Scottish representation in the new British Parliament would give Scotland disproportionate influence relative to its economic contribution, while others questioned whether the financial benefits promised to Scotland represented good value for English taxpayers, who would ultimately bear most of the cost. Queen Anne's personal intervention proved crucial in securing ratification by both parliaments. Her speeches to Parliament emphasised the religious and security benefits of union, while downplaying the economic costs, and her private conversations with key parliamentary leaders helped build the coalitions necessary to overcome opposition. The Queen's reputation for honesty and her obvious commitment to Protestant principles made her assurances about union's benefits more credible than similar arguments from politicians who might be suspected of pursuing narrow partisan advantages. The Act of Union officially took effect on May 1st, 1707, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain and establishing the Parliament of Great Britain at Westminster. The new British flag combined the crosses of St. George and St. Andrew, while the new British coat of arms incorporated symbols from both kingdoms. These ceremonial changes reflected the deeper constitutional reality that two separate nations had chosen to merge their political institutions while preserving their distinct cultural and religious identities. The immediate aftermath of union revealed both its benefits and its limitations. Scottish merchants gained access to English colonial markets for the first time, a development that would eventually contribute significantly to Scotland's economic development. The elimination of border tensions and the guarantee of Protestant succession provided the political stability that both kingdoms needed to focus on external challenges rather than internal conflicts. Yet union also created new tensions and disappointments that would influence British politics for generations. Many Scots felt that the promised economic benefits were slow to materialise, while the reality of Scottish underrepresentation in the new British Parliament, 45 members out of more than 500, made it difficult for Scottish interest to compete effectively with English priorities. These grievances would contribute to continued Jacobite sentiment and would resurface periodically throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. For Queen Anne personally, the achievement of union represented perhaps her greatest legacy as a monarch. The shy, stubborn woman who had endured so many personal tragedies had succeeded in creating the constitutional framework that would allow Great Britain to emerge as the dominant world power of the 18th and 19th centuries. The United Kingdom that exists today traces its origins directly to the legislation that Anne shepherded through Parliament during the middle years of her reign, making her the founding monarch of the modern British state. The Union of England and Scotland also established important precedents for the peaceful resolution of constitutional crises that would influence British political development for centuries to come. Rather than resolving their differences through warfare or royal decree, the two kingdoms had chosen negotiation and compromise, creating a model of parliamentary democracy and federal compromise that would later be applied to other challenges facing the expanding British Empire. Behind the ceremonial splendour and political achievements that marked Queen Anne's reign lay a private world of almost constant physical suffering that shaped every aspect of her daily existence and profoundly influenced her approach to royal duties, personal relationships, and the fundamental question of how to endure when one's own body has become an enemy rather than an ally. The Queen's medical history reads like a catalogue of the ailments that afflicted early 18th century life, but in her case, These conditions were compounded by the stress of royal responsibility and the particular vulnerabilities that came with her sex, her reproductive history, and her unfortunate genetic inheritance. The gout that would become Anne's most notorious medical condition had begun troubling her during her 30s, manifesting first as occasional episodes of joint pain that could be managed with rest and various remedies recommended by court physicians. But as the years passed, these attacks became more frequent and severe, eventually progressing to a chronic condition that left her joints swollen and inflamed, her mobility severely limited, and her daily existence dominated by the kind of persistent pain that exhausts both body and spirit. The disease particularly affected her feet and legs, making walking increasingly difficult and eventually impossible, so that she had to be carried in a specially designed chair for public appearances and state ceremonies. The visual impact of Anne's physical condition on court life was both profound and carefully managed. The Queen, who had once danced gracefully at court balls, was now unable to stand for extended periods, requiring accommodations that transformed traditional royal ceremonies while attempting to preserve their essential dignity. Her coronation chair had to be modified with a low back to accommodate her condition, while state portraits from her later years show a monarch whose massive frame reflects not only the progression of her illness, but also the medications and treatments that court physicians prescribed in their well-meaning, but often counterproductive attempts to provide relief. The underlying causes of Anne's various ailments remained mysterious to the medical practitioners of her era, whose understanding of disease was still heavily influenced by ancient theories about humoral imbalance, and whose treatments often did more harm than good. Modern medical historians have suggested that she may have suffered from systemic lupus erythematosus, a chronic autoimmune condition that would explain the complex array of symptoms that plagued her throughout her adult life: the joint pain, skin problems, fatigue, and reproductive difficulties that made even the most basic activities challenging and exhausting. The connection between Anne's physical sufferings and her tragic obstetric history represents one of the most heartbreaking aspects of her personal story. The 17 pregnancies that she endured during her marriage to Prince George resulted in a devastating pattern of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths that modern medicine might have been able to prevent, or at least better manage. Contemporary physicians could offer little beyond bloodletting, purges, and various herbal remedies that were more likely to weaken than strengthen a woman already struggling with systemic illness and the enormous physical demands of frequent pregnancy. The psychological impact of chronic pain and repeated reproductive failure created a secondary layer of suffering that was perhaps even more difficult to bear than the physical symptoms themselves. Anne's increasing tendency toward melancholy and withdrawal from social activities reflected not only the direct effects of her medical conditions, but also the emotional toll of living with constant discomfort while maintaining the public facade that royal duty required. The Queen, who appeared in state portraits surrounded by symbols of majesty and power, was privately dealing with pain levels that would have incapacitated most people, yet she continued to fulfill her royal obligations with remarkable consistency and dedication. Court physicians' attempts to treat Anne's various conditions reveal both the limitations of early 18th century medicine and the particular challenges of providing medical care to a patient whose every symptom became a matter of state concern. The Queen's medical team included some of the most respected practitioners of the era, but their treatments were based on theoretical frameworks that bore little relationship to the actual causes of her suffering. Bloodletting, considered essential for reducing inflammation and balancing the humours, likely worsened her condition by causing anemia and further weakening her immune system. The various spa treatments that Anne attempted Throughout her reign, visits to Bath, consumption of mineral waters, and prolonged stays at health-focused residences provided temporary relief more through their psychological benefits than through any direct medical efficacy. These retreats offered the Queen opportunities to rest away from the demanding pace of court life, to receive sympathetic attention from medical specialists, and to hope that the next treatment might finally provide the lasting relief that had so far eluded her. The rituals of taking the waters and following prescribed regimens gave structure and purpose to her suffering, while allowing her to feel that she was actively pursuing solutions rather than simply enduring. The impact of Anne's physical condition on her political decision-making reveals the complex ways in which personal and public responsibilities intersected in the life of an early modern monarch. During periods when her pain was particularly severe, she was forced to delegate more authority to ministers and courtiers, a necessity that sometimes strengthened the hand of political factions seeking to influence royal policy. Her increasing reliance on Abigail Masham during the final years of her reign reflected not only personal preference, but also practical necessity. Abigail's gentle manner and understanding of Anne's medical needs made her invaluable as both companion and caregiver. The Queen's daily routine had to be carefully structured around her physical limitations, with morning ceremonies scheduled for times when her energy levels were typically highest, and afternoon activities planned to minimize the strain on her increasingly fragile health. State dinners became exercises in endurance, with Anne often suffering through hours of formal dining while dealing with pain that made eating difficult and conversation exhausting. The elaborate court dress required for such occasions added another layer of discomfort, as heavy fabrics and restrictive corsets compounded the joint pain and breathing difficulties that were her constant companions. Anne's relationship with food during her later years reflected both the direct effects of her medical conditions and the medications prescribed to treat them. The dramatic weight gain that characterized her middle age was likely due to a combination of factors: reduced mobility caused by joint pain, fluid retention related to her systemic illness, and possibly the effects of various treatments that altered her metabolism and appetite regulation. Court observers, who mocked her obesity, failed to understand that her physical appearance reflected serious medical conditions rather than simple gluttony or lack of self-control. The Queen's sleep patterns were profoundly disrupted by her various ailments, with joint pain, breathing difficulties, and other symptoms making restful sleep increasingly elusive. This chronic sleep deprivation added another dimension to her suffering, while also affecting her cognitive function and emotional stability during crucial political negotiations and decision-making processes. The royal bedchamber became as much a medical facility as a private retreat, equipped with various devices designed to minimize discomfort and staffed by attendants trained to provide assistance during the difficult nighttime hours. Perhaps most remarkably, Anne managed to maintain her royal duties with remarkable consistency, despite the enormous challenges that her physical condition created. State papers from throughout her reign show evidence of her continued attention to government business even during periods of severe illness, while foreign ambassadors' reports describe a queen who managed to project dignity and authority despite obvious physical suffering. This dedication to duty in the face of personal adversity represents one of the most admirable aspects of Anne's character and helps explain why she retained the respect and affection of her subjects even during politically controversial periods of her reign. The progression of Anne's various medical conditions during the final years of her life created a sense of approaching crisis that affected both her personal relationships and the broader political situation. As her health declined, the succession question became increasingly urgent. While the physical demands of kingship raised questions about how long she could continue to fulfill her royal obligations effectively, the Queen's own awareness of her mortality added poignancy to her final political decisions and intensified her desire to leave behind a stable constitutional settlement that would outlast her own brief time on the throne. As Queen Anne's reign entered its second decade, the military triumphs and political stability that had characterized its early years began to give way to a more complex and troubling landscape of war weariness, party conflict, and personal betrayals that would ultimately reshape the fundamental dynamics of English government. The War of the Spanish Succession, which had brought such glory to English arms through Marlborough's victories, had also exacted an enormous cost in blood and treasure that was becoming increasingly difficult for the nation to bear, while the domestic political consequences of prolonged warfare were creating new tensions between Crown and Parliament, between different religious factions, and between the competing visions of England's role in European affairs that divided Whig and Tory politicians. The financial burden of maintaining large armies on the continent had grown to unprecedented levels, requiring new forms of taxation and government borrowing that strained traditional relationships between different social classes and economic interests. The land tax that fell most heavily on the Tory gentry, who formed the backbone of Anne's natural political support, had reached levels that seemed almost confiscatory, while the expanding national debt created a new class of financial interests whose profits from government lending made them enthusiastic supporters of continued warfare. This division between those who paid for the war through taxation and those who profited from it through lending created political tensions that cut across traditional party lines and complicated Anne's attempts to maintain national unity. The human cost of the war was becoming equally difficult to sustain, as reports from the continental battlefields told of casualties that seemed to grow larger with each passing campaign season. The Battle of Malplaquet in 1709, though technically a victory for Marlborough and his allies, had cost so many lives that it felt more like a defeat to the families who had lost sons, fathers and brothers in what seemed like an endless conflict. The heroic narrative of English military prowess that had sustained public enthusiasm during the early years of the war was giving way to more sober questions about whether continued fighting was worth the enormous price being paid by ordinary English families. Queen Anne herself was beginning to share these doubts about the wisdom of prolonged continental warfare, though her concerns were as much personal as political. The stress of managing wartime government had taken a severe toll on her already fragile health, while the constant demands of coalition diplomacy and military planning left little time for the quieter pursuits that might have provided relief from the chronic pain and fatigue that plagued her daily existence. More troubling still was her growing realization that the war had become a vehicle for political ambitions that seemed to have little connection to England's genuine national interests. The relationship between Anne and the Marlborough family, which had been the cornerstone of her government's success during the war's early years, was showing signs of strain that reflected both personal grievances and fundamental disagreements about policy direction. Sarah Churchill's increasingly domineering behaviour toward the Queen had created resentments that were beginning to affect governmental decision-making, while the Duke's continued insistence on aggressive military action seemed to conflict with Anne's growing desire for a negotiated peace that would allow England to consolidate its gains without risking further losses. The emergence of Robert Harley as an alternative source of political advice represented a crucial shift in the dynamics of Anne's government and reflected her desire to free herself from the Marlborough connection that had become as much a source of constraint as strength. Harley, a skilled parliamentary manager with strong Tory credentials, offered the Queen a different vision of English policy that emphasised domestic priorities over continental ambitions and promised to reduce both the financial and political costs of prolonged warfare. His quiet competence and respectful manner provided a stark contrast to Sarah Churchill's hectoring style, and made him increasingly attractive to a queen who was tired of being lectured about her political and moral obligations. The domestic political landscape was also shifting in ways that reflected the war's long-term consequences for English constitutional development. The expansion of government borrowing and taxation had created new administrative structures that increased the Crown's independence from traditional sources of revenue, while also creating new forms of parliamentary oversight that limited royal discretion in financial matters. The emergence of more systematic party organisation, driven by the need to manage complex legislative agendas and coordinate policy across different governmental institutions, was beginning to transform the informal factional politics that had characterised earlier periods into something approaching a modern party system. Religious issues, which had seemed settled during the early years of Anne's reign, were re-emerging as sources of political conflict that complicated efforts to maintain national unity during wartime. The Queen's natural sympathy for High Church Anglicanism conflicted with the Whig commitment to religious toleration that had been necessary to maintain the Grand Alliance, while growing concerns about Jacobite infiltration of the Tory party created suspicions about the loyalty of those who questioned continued warfare against Catholic France. These religious and dynastic anxieties added another layer of complexity to political debates that were already strained by disagreements over military strategy and fiscal policy. The trial of Dr. Henry Sacheverell in 1710 crystallized these various tensions into a public crisis that would fundamentally alter the political balance of Anne's government and mark the beginning of the end for Whig dominance in English politics. Sacheverell, a High Church clergyman whose sermons had attacked the principles of religious toleration and criticized the Godolphin ministry's war policies, became a symbolic figure around whom opponents of the government could rally. His impeachment by the House of Commons for seditious preaching transformed what might have been a minor ecclesiastical controversy into a major constitutional crisis that exposed the deep divisions within English society about religion, politics, and the proper limits of government authority. The public response to Sacheverell's trial revealed the extent to which war weariness and religious anxiety had undermined support for the Whig ministry that had guided England through most of the European conflict. Crowds gathered in London to support the embattled clergyman, viewing his prosecution as an attack on the Church of England itself and evidence of the government's sympathy for religious dissent. The riots that accompanied the trial proceedings showed that popular opinion was turning against the policies that had made England a major European power, but had also imposed unprecedented burdens on ordinary subjects who were beginning to question whether continental glory was worth domestic hardship. Queen Anne's response to the Sacheverell crisis reflected her growing dissatisfaction with the Whig ministry and her desire to pursue policies more in line with her own religious and political convictions. While she did not openly oppose Sacheverell's prosecution, her obvious sympathy for his High Church principles and her measured response to the popular unrest signalled a shift in royal attitudes that encouraged Tory politicians to hope for a restoration to favour. The Queen's insistence that Sacheverell's punishment should be mild rather than severe demonstrated her understanding of popular sentiment and her desire to avoid further inflaming religious tensions. The political realignment that followed the Sacheverell trial represented one of the most dramatic reversals in English parliamentary history, as the Whig ministry that had seemed unassailable during the years of military victory suddenly found itself vulnerable to attacks based on war weariness, fiscal exhaustion, and religious anxiety. The general election of 1710 produced a massive Tory majority in the House of Commons, reflecting popular dissatisfaction with Whig policies and creating the political foundation for a fundamental change in governmental direction. Robert Harley's emergence as the leader of the new Tory ministry marked a crucial turning point in both Anne's reign and the broader development of English constitutional government. Unlike previous royal favourites who had relied primarily on personal relationships with the monarch, Harley combined genuine parliamentary skills with administrative competence and a clear vision of alternative policies that addressed the concerns that had brought down his Whig predecessors. His appointment as Chancellor of the Exchequer and later as Lord Treasurer gave Anne the kind of minister she had long desired: competent, respectful, and committed to policies that reflected her own preferences rather than those of dominant court factions. The new ministry's most pressing challenge was negotiating an end to the War of the Spanish Succession that would preserve England's essential interests while reducing the financial and human costs that had made continued fighting politically unsustainable. This required delicate diplomatic manoeuvring that balanced the competing demands of England's continental allies, who wanted continued military pressure on France, and domestic opinion, which was increasingly insistent on peace regardless of the terms. Harley and his colleagues had to find ways to withdraw England from active military participation without appearing to betray their allies or surrender the advantages that Marlborough's victories had secured. The dismissal of the Duke of Marlborough in December 1711 represented both the culmination of the political changes that had been building throughout Anne's reign and a personal tragedy for the Queen, who lost not only her most successful military commander but also the husband of her former dearest friend. The Duke's removal from command was politically necessary to signal the ministry's commitment to peace negotiations, but it also marked the end of an era in which military glory had provided national unity and royal prestige. Anne's decision to support Harley over Marlborough reflected her evolution from a queen who had relied heavily on personal relationships to one who was willing to make difficult political choices based on her assessment of national needs. The secret negotiations that led to the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of Anne's personal diplomacy, as she used her royal correspondence to facilitate discussions that formal diplomatic channels could not have managed. Her letters to European monarchs, particularly her exchanges with Louis XIV of France, reflected a more sophisticated understanding of international relations than her critics had expected and contributed significantly to achieving peace terms that satisfied England's essential requirements, while allowing face-saving compromises for other parties to the conflict. The domestic political consequences of the peace negotiations revealed the extent to which party conflict had become institutionalized during Anne's reign, transforming the informal factional disputes of earlier periods into more systematic opposition between organized political groups with distinct ideological commitments. The Whig minority in Parliament attacked the peace terms as a betrayal of England's allies and a surrender of hard-won military advantages, while Tory supporters argued that continued warfare would have bankrupted the nation without producing correspondingly greater benefits. Anne's creation of 12 new peers to ensure ratification of the peace treaty marked one of the most controversial exercises of royal prerogative during her reign and established important precedents for future constitutional conflicts between Crown and Parliament. This mass creation of peerages was unprecedented in English history and was widely criticised as a corruption of the House of Lords that violated traditional limits on royal power. Yet from Anne's perspective, it was a necessary response to Whig obstructionism that threatened to prolong a war that had already cost far more than it was worth. The successful conclusion of the War of the Spanish Succession through the Treaty of Utrecht represented perhaps Anne's greatest achievement as a monarch. demonstrating her ability to make difficult political decisions and pursue long-term national interests despite intense partisan pressure and personal relationships that might have counseled different choices. The treaty secured England's essential objectives: recognition of the Protestant succession, territorial gains in North America and the Mediterranean, and commercial advantages that would contribute to future prosperity, while ending a conflict that had strained the nation's resources to the breaking point. Yet the political methods that Anne had been forced to use to achieve peace also revealed the growing tensions within the English constitutional system that would shape political development for generations to come. The conflict between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority, between different visions of England's international role, and between competing religious and economic interests, had been temporarily resolved but not permanently settled. The precedents established during the final years of Anne's reign would influence constitutional debates well into the 18th century and beyond. The personal cost of these political achievements was enormous for a queen whose health was already severely compromised by chronic illness and the accumulated stress of more than a decade of difficult governance. The effort required to manage the complex political maneuvering that led to peace, combined with the emotional toll of breaking with old friends and allies, left Anne exhausted and increasingly isolated. The woman who had once relied heavily on personal relationships to guide her political decisions found herself surrounded by ministers who respected her authority but could not provide the emotional support that she desperately needed. In the final years of Queen Anne's reign, the palace corridors that had once echoed with the laughter of close friendships and the animated discussions of trusted advisors grew increasingly quiet, reflecting the profound isolation that had become the defining characteristic of her later life. The woman who had begun her reign, surrounded by devoted friends and supported by a loving husband, now found herself navigating the treacherous waters of early 18th century politics with only the most formal relationships to sustain her, as death, betrayal, and the inevitable loneliness of absolute power combined to strip away virtually every source of personal comfort that had sustained her through earlier trials. The death of Prince George in October 1708 had removed the one person who had loved Anne unconditionally without regard for her political decisions or royal status, and whose steady presence had provided an anchor of stability throughout the tumultuous early years of her reign. George's passing left a void in Anne's emotional life that no amount of royal ceremony or political success could fill, transforming her from a woman who had found strength in loving partnership into a solitary figure who faced each day's challenges without the quiet support that had made such difficulties bearable. The Queen's grief for her husband was made more poignant by the knowledge that their shared sorrows, the deaths of their children, the burdens of royal duty, the complexities of court politics, had created a bond that could never be replicated with anyone else. The breakdown of Anne's friendship with Sarah Churchill had eliminated another crucial source of emotional support, replacing the companionship that had sustained her since childhood, with bitter recriminations and public embarrassment that made the Queen's isolation even more complete. Where she had once been able to confide her deepest fears and concerns to someone who understood both her personal vulnerabilities and her royal responsibilities, Anne now found herself surrounded by courtiers and ministers who offered respect and deference, but could not provide the kind of intimate understanding that genuine friendship requires. The transformation of Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman, from loving correspondents into formal adversaries, symbolized the broader pattern of personal loss that had come to characterize Anne's later years. Even her growing reliance on Abigail Masham, while providing some measure of companionship and practical assistance, could not fully compensate for these deeper losses, as the relationship remained necessarily constrained by the vast differences in their social positions and the political suspicions that surrounded any royal favourite. Abigail's gentle nature and genuine concern for Anne's welfare made her invaluable as a source of daily comfort, but she lacked both the intellectual sophistication and the long shared history that had made Sarah Churchill such a compelling companion during Anne's younger years. The Queen's attachment to Abigail was thus characterized more by dependency than by equality, reflecting Anne's desperate need for human connection rather than the mutual affection that had marked her earlier friendships. The political changes that had brought Robert Harley and his Tory colleagues to power had also altered the fundamental dynamics of Anne's government in ways that increased her formal authority, while paradoxically reducing her personal influence over day-to-day policy decisions. Where the Marlborough era had been characterized by informal consultation and personal relationships that allowed Anne to shape government policy through private conversations and subtle influence, the new ministry operated according to more systematic procedures that respected royal prerogative, while limiting opportunities for the kind of intimate political discussion that Anne had always preferred. Harley's competence and loyalty were unquestionable, but his professional manner could not provide the emotional engagement that had made political decision-making more tolerable during earlier periods. The succession question that had haunted Anne throughout her reign became increasingly urgent as her health declined, and it became clear that she would never produce the heir that might have secured the Stuart dynasty's continuation. The knowledge that her death would bring the Hanoverian George Ludwig to the English throne created complex feelings of failure and resignation that compounded her sense of personal isolation. Anne understood intellectually that the Protestant succession was essential for England's stability, and that her own inability to provide an alternative heir made the Hanoverian settlement inevitable. But emotionally, she could not escape the feeling that she was presiding over the end of a royal line that had ruled Scotland for more than 3 centuries. The Queen's relationship with the Hanoverian heir apparent remained distant and formal throughout her reign, reflecting both practical difficulties and deeper emotional reluctances that made it impossible for her to develop the kind of personal connection that might have eased the eventual transition. George Ludwig's visits to England were rare and carefully managed affairs that emphasized diplomatic protocol rather than family relationships, while Anne's own reluctance to acknowledge the inevitability of Hanoverian succession prevented her from taking steps that might have made the eventual change of dynasty less abrupt and potentially destabilizing. The daily routines of Anne's later years reflected both her physical limitations and her emotional isolation, as chronic illness and personal grief combined to create a life that was increasingly circumscribed, despite the theoretical unlimited power that came with royal authority. Her mornings were typically devoted to the administrative business of government, reviewing state papers and meeting with ministers in formal sessions that followed established procedures, rather than encouraging the kind of spontaneous discussion that might have provided intellectual stimulation or personal engagement. These official duties, while performed with characteristic conscientiousness, had become more burden than pleasure, necessary obligations rather than opportunities for meaningful activity. Her afternoons and evenings offered little relief from this pattern of dutiful but unsatisfying activity, as court ceremonies and social obligations required the maintenance of royal dignity, while providing few opportunities for genuine human connection. The elaborate dinners and receptions that filled her social calendar were exercises in endurance rather than enjoyment, requiring Anne to smile and converse while dealing with constant physical pain and the emotional exhaustion that comes from sustained performance of public roles. The Queen, who had once found pleasure in court entertainments, now saw them primarily as additional burdens that had to be endured rather than experiences that might provide distraction from her personal sorrows. The religious devotions that had always been important to Anne became even more central to her daily routine during these final years, providing perhaps the only source of genuine comfort and peace that remained available to her. Her private prayers and religious reading offered respite from the political calculations and personal disappointments that dominated her waking hours, while her participation in church services provided structure and meaning that secular activities could not match. The faith that had sustained her through the deaths of her children and the breakdown of her marriage now became her primary defense against the loneliness and physical suffering that characterized her final years as queen. Anne's awareness of her own mortality added another dimension to the isolation of her later years, as the knowledge that her time was limited made every decision feel more consequential, while also highlighting the transitory nature of all earthly achievements. The constitutional settlement that she had worked so hard to establish, the military victories that had brought glory to English arms, the union with Scotland that had created Great Britain, all of these accomplishments would outlive her, but they could not provide the kind of personal satisfaction that comes from knowing one's life has been filled with meaningful relationships and genuine happiness. The letters and state papers from Anne's final years reveal a woman who had learned to perform the role of queen with remarkable skill and dedication, while struggling with private sorrows that few of her subjects could have imagined. Her correspondence with foreign monarchs demonstrates sophisticated understanding of international relations, while her interactions with parliamentary leaders showed tactical political skills that had developed considerably since the uncertain early years of her reign. Yet these same documents also contain subtle indications of the loneliness and physical suffering that made each day a challenge to be endured rather than an opportunity to be embraced. The Queen's increasing reliance on formal protocols and established procedures during her final years reflected not only her physical limitations, but also her emotional need for predictable structures that could provide stability in a world that had taken away most of her sources of personal comfort. The elaborate ceremonial requirements that govern court life, while sometimes criticized as excessive formality, actually served important psychological functions for a monarch whose private life had been stripped of most spontaneous joy and intimate connection. The irony of Anne's situation during these final years was that she had achieved most of the political objectives that she had set for herself as queen, ending the costly Continental War, establishing the union with Scotland, maintaining religious stability, and preserving constitutional government. Yet these very achievements had required personal sacrifices that left her feeling empty and alone despite her apparent success. The crown that she had worn with such dignity had become a burden that isolated her from ordinary human experience while demanding constant performance of duties that provided little personal satisfaction. The summer of 1714 brought an oppressive heat to London that seemed to press down upon the already weakened frame of Queen Anne, like a physical manifestation of the political and personal pressures that had accumulated during her 12 years on the throne. At Kensington Palace, where she had chosen to spend these final months of her life, the Queen moved through her daily routines with the deliberate care of someone who understood that each day might be her last, yet who remained determined to fulfill her royal obligations until the very end. The woman who had once danced at court balls now required assistance to move from room to room, her body ravaged by years of chronic illness and the accumulated toll of bearing 17 children, losing them all, and carrying the weight of crown and kingdom through some of the most challenging years in English history. The political crisis that would dominate Anne's final months began with her growing dissatisfaction with Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, the minister who had served her faithfully since the great political realignment of 1710, but who had increasingly lost her confidence as his competence deteriorated under the pressures of office and personal weakness. Harley's drinking had become a serious problem, affecting his ability to conduct government business and undermining his effectiveness in managing the complex parliamentary coalitions that effective governance required. More troubling still were reports that he had been conducting secret negotiations with the Jacobite court in France, activities that raised fundamental questions about his loyalty to the Protestant succession that Anne had worked so hard to secure. The Queen's decision to dismiss Harley in July 1714 represented one of her final assertions of royal authority, but it also created a governmental crisis at the worst possible moment for someone whose health was clearly failing. The removal of a Lord Treasurer without having a suitable replacement ready violated basic principles of administrative continuity and left the government in the hands of ministers who lacked both the experience and the parliamentary support necessary to manage the succession crisis that everyone knew was approaching. Anne's action demonstrated that she retained both the will and the constitutional authority to make crucial political decisions, but it also revealed how isolated she had become from the kind of reliable political advice that effective monarchy required. The struggle to find Harley's replacement exposed the fundamental weakness of Anne's position during these final weeks of her life, as the personal relationships that had once allowed her to manage political transitions through informal consultation had been destroyed by years of conflict and betrayal. The Duke of Marlborough had been dismissed and remained in exile. Sarah Churchill was persona non grata at court, and most of the other political figures who had shaped the early years of Anne's reign were either dead, discredited, or alienated. The Queen found herself dependent on a small circle of advisers whose loyalty was unquestionable, but whose political skills were inadequate to the challenges they faced. The physical symptoms that had troubled Anne intermittently throughout her reign now began to intensify in ways that made it clear to everyone around her that a final crisis was approaching. The gout that had plagued her for years became more severe, while new symptoms, difficulty speaking, confusion, and episodes of unconsciousness suggested that her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Court physicians, working with the limited medical knowledge of their era, could offer little beyond traditional treatments that were more likely to weaken than strengthen someone in Anne's condition, while the political uncertainty created by her obvious illness added another layer of stress that made recovery even less likely. The Queen's awareness of her approaching death created a complex mixture of resignation, anxiety, and determination that characterized her final weeks. She had long understood that her failure to produce a living heir made the Hanoverian succession inevitable, and she had worked consistently to ensure that the transition would occur smoothly, despite her personal preferences for the Stuart line. Yet the knowledge that her death would mark the end of a dynasty that had ruled Scotland since 1371 and had united the British crown since 1603 added emotional weight to physical suffering that would have been difficult enough to bear under any circumstances. The problem of the succession became increasingly urgent as Anne's condition worsened, particularly because of persistent rumours that she harboured secret sympathies for her half-brother James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, whose claims to the throne had been explicitly rejected by the Act of Settlement. These rumours, while probably unfounded, reflected genuine uncertainties about Anne's true feelings regarding the Hanoverian succession and created anxieties among Whig politicians who feared that a dying queen might attempt some last-minute action to alter the constitutional settlement that had been established since 1701. The final crisis of Anne's reign came on July 30th, 1714. when she suffered what was almost certainly a severe stroke that left her unable to speak and barely conscious. The date was grimly significant. It marked the 14th anniversary of her son, William's death, a connection that could not have been lost on a queen who had never recovered from the loss of her only surviving child. The stroke that would prove fatal occurred during a meeting of the Privy Council, dramatically illustrating the extent to which Anne had continued to fulfill her royal duties, even as her physical condition made such activities increasingly dangerous. The constitutional procedures that governed the transfer of power during a monarch's incapacitation had to be improvised on the spot, as there was no clear precedent for managing a situation in which the sovereign was alive but unable to communicate or make decisions. The Privy Council, acting with remarkable efficiency despite the unprecedented circumstances, took control of the situation and managed the immediate governmental crisis while preparing for the succession that everyone knew was imminent. Their decision to place the staff of Lord Treasurer in the hands of the Duke of Shrewsbury, a respected Whig grandee who commanded confidence across party lines, helped ensure governmental continuity during the crucial transition period. Anne's final hours were spent in the same quiet dignity that had characterized her approach to royal duty throughout her reign, surrounded by ministers and courtiers who respected her commitment to constitutional government, even as they prepared for the dramatic changes that her death would bring. The Queen, who had once been sustained by loving friendship and marital devotion, died in the formal atmosphere of court protocol, attended by officials whose presence reflected duty rather than affection, but who nonetheless recognized the historical significance of the moment they were witnessing. Dr. John Arbuthnot, Anne's longtime physician, and one of the few people who had observed her struggles at close range throughout her reign, captured the poignancy of her final moments in his letter to Jonathan Swift. "I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveller than death was to her." This observation reflected not only the physical suffering that had marked Anne's final years, but also the emotional exhaustion that comes from bearing responsibilities that provide little personal satisfaction while exacting enormous personal costs. Queen Anne died at approximately 7:30 in the morning on August 1st, 1714, ending a reign that had lasted just over 12 years, but had fundamentally transformed the British Isles and established constitutional precedents that would influence political development for centuries to come. Her death was peaceful, a merciful end to years of chronic pain and personal isolation that had made her final years more burden than blessing despite her remarkable political achievements. The woman who had united England and Scotland into Great Britain, who had overseen military victories that established her nation as a European power, and who had navigated the complex transition from personal monarchy to constitutional government, finally found the rest that had eluded her throughout her troubled but remarkably consequential life. The immediate aftermath of Anne's death demonstrated both the effectiveness of the constitutional settlement she had helped to establish and the personal isolation that had characterized her final years. The Hanoverian succession proceeded smoothly, with George Ludwig proclaimed as George I without serious opposition, while Anne's funeral was conducted with appropriate royal dignity, but little of the genuine popular mourning that might have been expected for a monarch who had served her subjects with such dedication. The Queen, who had given her life to public service, was remembered more for her political legacy than for the personal relationships that had once sustained her, but had gradually been sacrificed to the demands of royal duty. In the quiet chambers of Westminster Abbey, where Queen Anne's earthly remains found their final rest, beside those of her beloved husband Prince George and the children who had predeceased them both, the last Stuart monarch left behind a legacy that was as complex and contradictory as the woman who had created it. The reign that had begun in 1702 with such uncertainty, a childless queen ascending to the throne during wartime, facing religious divisions and constitutional questions that had destroyed previous monarchs, had concluded with achievements that would reshape the British Isles and influence the development of constitutional government throughout the English-speaking world. The Act of Union of 1707, perhaps Anne's most enduring constitutional achievement, had created the Kingdom of Great Britain and established the political framework that would allow the British Isles to emerge as the dominant world power of the 18th and 19th centuries. The careful balance between integration and autonomy that characterised the Union settlement, preserving Scottish law, religion and cultural identity while creating unified political institutions, provided a model for federal arrangements that would later be applied throughout the expanding British Empire. The Parliament of Great Britain that Anne had helped to create would govern not only the home islands, but eventually vast territories across North America, Asia, and the Pacific, making her constitutional innovations the foundation for a global political system. The military victories achieved during Anne's reign, particularly those associated with the Duke of Marlborough's campaigns in the War of the Spanish Succession, had established Britain's reputation as a major European power and created the naval and military traditions that would sustain British global influence for generations. The Treaty of Utrecht, which ended that costly but ultimately successful conflict, had secured territorial gains in North America and the Mediterranean, while establishing commercial advantages that would contribute significantly to Britain's economic development during the 18th century. The precedent of using British military power to maintain the European balance of power would influence foreign policy decisions well into the 20th century. Perhaps more importantly, Anne's reign had witnessed the emergence of the two-party system that would become the foundation of modern British parliamentary democracy. The competition between Whigs and Tories that had characterised her 12 years on the throne had evolved from informal factional disputes into more systematic political organisations with distinct ideological commitments and organisational structures. The precedents established during Anne's reign regarding the relationship between Crown and Parliament, the role of political parties in forming governments, and the management of policy debates through constitutional rather than revolutionary means would shape British political development for centuries to come. The religious settlement that Anne had maintained throughout her reign had preserved the essential Protestant character of the English establishment, while avoiding the kind of sectarian conflicts that had plagued previous generations. Her careful balance between supporting the Church of England and tolerating Protestant dissent had created a model of religious policy that emphasized stability over theological purity, and that would prove remarkably durable despite periodic challenges from various directions. The precedent of monarchical support for established religion combined with practical tolerance for religious diversity would influence church-state relationships throughout the British world. Yet these remarkable political achievements had been purchased at enormous personal cost, creating a pattern of sacrificial monarchy that would influence royal behaviour for generations. Anne's willingness to subordinate personal preferences to public necessities, breaking with beloved friends when political circumstances required it, dismissing trusted advisors when governmental effectiveness demanded changes, and enduring physical suffering while maintaining royal duties, established expectations about monarchical behaviour that would prove both inspiring and burdensome for her successors. The model of monarchy that Anne created through her personal example emphasized duty over pleasure, public service over private happiness, and constitutional responsibility over personal relationships. The tragedy of Anne's personal life, 17 pregnancies that produced no living heirs, the loss of her closest friendships to political conflicts, The death of her devoted husband, and her final years of increasing isolation despite apparent political success, illustrated the human costs of effective monarchy in an era when personal and political relationships were impossible to separate. Her story became a cautionary tale about the loneliness of power and the difficulty of maintaining authentic human connections while fulfilling the demanding requirements of constitutional kingship. The historiographical treatment of Anne's reign reflected many of the personal and political tensions that had characterized her actual experience as queen. Early accounts, heavily influenced by Sarah Churchill's vindictive memoirs, portrayed Anne as a weak and intellectually limited monarch who had been manipulated by stronger personalities and had succeeded despite rather than because of her personal qualities. This interpretation, which emphasized Anne's physical ailments and personal vulnerabilities while minimizing her political achievements, persisted well into the 20th century and contributed to her reputation as one of England's less significant monarchs. More recent scholarship has challenged this negative assessment and has recognized Anne's considerable political skills, her genuine commitment to constitutional government, and her ability to navigate complex political situations with remarkable effectiveness despite serious personal limitations. Modern historians have noted her success in managing the transition from personal to constitutional monarchy, her skill in balancing competing political factions, and her ability to make difficult decisions based on long-term national interests rather than short-term personal advantages. This reassessment has revealed Anne as a more complex and capable figure than earlier generations had recognized. The constitutional precedents established during Anne's reign proved remarkably durable and continued to influence British political development long after the specific circumstances that had created them had disappeared. The principle that monarchs should reign rather than rule, while not fully established during Anne's lifetime, was significantly advanced by her willingness to work within parliamentary constraints and to accept ministerial advice even when it conflicted with her personal preferences. The evolution of cabinet government, the development of party politics, and the establishment of regular parliamentary sessions all received crucial development during her reign. The cultural impact of Anne's reign was equally significant, though perhaps less immediately obvious than its political consequences. The flowering of English literature, architecture, and music during the early 18th century occurred against the backdrop of the political stability and economic prosperity that her government had helped to create. The age of Queen Anne became associated with cultural achievements that reflected the confidence and creativity that political success had made possible, while the architectural legacy of her reign, including the completion of St. Paul's Cathedral and the construction of numerous country houses in the emerging Georgian style, provided physical monuments to the prosperity and stability of her era. The international influence of Anne's constitutional innovations extended far beyond the British Isles, as the precedents established during her reign were studied and sometimes imitated by political reformers throughout Europe and North America. The balance between monarchical authority and parliamentary control that characterized her government provided a model for constitutional arrangements that avoided both absolute monarchy and democratic excess, appealing to reformers who sought political change without revolutionary upheaval. The American colonial experience during Anne's reign established many of the administrative and constitutional patterns that would later influence the development of independent American government. The economic policies pursued during Anne's reign, particularly the expansion of international trade and the development of more sophisticated financial instruments, laid the foundation for Britain's emergence as the world's dominant commercial power during the 18th century. The combination of military success, territorial expansion, and improved access to colonial markets created the conditions for economic growth that would sustain British global influence For more than 2 centuries, the precedent of using state power to support commercial expansion while maintaining fiscal responsibility would influence economic policy throughout the modern era. Perhaps most poignantly, Anne's personal story of loss, sacrifice, and lonely dedication to duty resonated with subsequent generations, who recognized in her experience the universal human struggles with mortality, disappointment, and the difficulty of finding meaning in lives that must balance personal desires with social responsibilities. Her willingness to continue serving despite physical pain, emotional isolation, and personal grief provided an inspiring example of perseverance that transcended the specific political circumstances of her era. The reign of Queen Anne thus stands as one of the most consequential in British history, marked by constitutional innovations, military victories, and political developments that would influence the course of world history for centuries to come. Yet, it was also profoundly shaped by the personal struggles of a woman who sacrificed her own happiness for the welfare of her subjects, and who found in duty the meaning that eluded her in personal relationships. The lonely queen, who united a kingdom and created modern Britain, left behind a legacy that was both triumphant and tragic, demonstrating both the possibilities and the costs of effective political leadership in an age when personal and public life could not be separated. In the end, Anne's greatest achievement may have been her demonstration that constitutional monarchy could work, that a system of government based on the careful balance of monarchical dignity, parliamentary authority, and popular consent could provide both effective governance and political stability. The precedents she established and the institutions she helped to create would prove remarkably durable, surviving challenges from revolution, world wars, and social transformation to remain vital elements of political systems throughout the modern world. The shy, stubborn princess who had endured such personal tragedy had created political arrangements that would serve millions of people she would never meet, in countries that did not yet exist, facing challenges that could not have been imagined during her lifetime. As our long journey through Queen Anne's remarkable yet heartbreaking life draws to its peaceful close, we find ourselves in those quiet pre-dawn hours of August 1st, 1714, when a tired soul finally found the rest that had eluded her throughout her troubled reign. The woman who had begun life as a shy second daughter, overshadowed by her brilliant sister Mary, had somehow transformed herself into the architect of modern Britain, uniting ancient kingdoms and creating constitutional frameworks that would endure for centuries. Anne's story reminds us that history's greatest achievements often emerge from lives marked by profound personal sorrow, that the strongest foundations are sometimes laid by those who seem most fragile, and that the most lasting legacies frequently come from rulers who sacrificed their own happiness for the welfare of subjects they would never personally meet. The Queen, who lost 17 children yet mothered a nation, who endured the betrayal of her dearest friends yet never abandoned her duty to her people, who suffered constant physical pain yet provided the steady leadership that her era desperately needed. In the end, perhaps Anne's greatest triumph was not any single political achievement, but rather her demonstration that ordinary human virtues, persistence, loyalty, quiet courage, and stubborn dedication to duty, could accomplish extraordinary things when applied consistently over time. The lonely queen, who felt abandoned by those she loved most, had actually created something far more durable than any personal relationship, a constitutional settlement that would allow millions of people to live in freedom and prosperity long after her own brief time on earth had ended. As we prepare to close this gentle chapter of history and drift toward our own peaceful rest, what aspect of Queen Anne's bittersweet journey resonates most deeply with you? Was it her remarkable perseverance through repeated personal tragedies, her quiet transformation from grieving mother to effective monarch, or perhaps the way she managed to unite ancient enemies and create lasting peace from the chaos of war and religious conflict. If tonight's peaceful exploration of royal history has helped guide you toward that perfect drowsy state we all seek, a gentle like would be wonderfully appreciated. And if you haven't already joined our growing Sleepy Crown family, consider subscribing for more soothing historical journeys designed to accompany you into restful sleep. Sweet dreams, dear friends, and may you find in sleep the peace that Queen Anne discovered only at the very end of her remarkable, melancholy, and ultimately triumphant life. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history whispers you gently toward tomorrow's dreams